All right, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This is going to be number 4, reading brief number 4 in the Gateway Experience, the Brain Hemisphere Synchronization in Perspective. And at on number 3, we stopped at the brain in phase. I'm just going to reread number 15 and this quote here just to sort of reset the stage and get your mind and my mind back into what we're talking about here. Contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. The consciousness process is most easily envisaged if we picture the holographic input with a three-dimensional grid system superimposed over it, such that all the energy patterns contained within can be described in terms of three-dimensional geometry, using mathematics to reduce the data to two-dimensional form. Bentov states that scientists suspect the human mind operates on a simple binary, go or no-go system, as do all digital computers. Therefore, once it superimposes a three-dimensional matrix over holographic information, it wishes to interpret and reduces the information mathematically to two-dimensional form. It can completely process it using its fundamental binary system, just as any computer made by the hand of man can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in the same way, perceiving by comparison only. Bentov states that the proposition this way: our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. When we perceive something, we always perceive differences only. And I know I said that was true, but it's only true if you don't follow what some people call the blank slate model. And I just wanted to make that amendment. In states of expanded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain, its holistic, nonlinear, nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary matrix or receptor of this holographic input, while by operating in a phase or coherence with the right brain, the left hemisphere provides the secondary matrix through its binary, computer-like method of functioning to screen further data by comparison and reduce it to a discrete two-dimensional form. That it does sound basic once you've read this a couple times. It almost seems like it's oversimplifying the complexity and the process of the brain. Like I said, I think other sensory input is what makes things three-dimensional, like sight and sound and light. But it's hard for me to explain that without it's just my thought on that. Not that I could prove it. I'm sure that there's new research that may qualify or nullify what I just said. So now we're going to start fresh here on number 16. Evaluation. To the extent that Gateway succeeds in bringing about a refinement in energy matrix of the mind, it succeeds in expanding or alerting human consciousness so that it can perceive without recourse to the intercession of the physical senses, such that ever more of the universal hologram can ultimately be perceived and understood. Marilyn Ferguson has written that the theories of Pribram and Bohm appear to account for all transcendental experience, paranormal events, and even normal perceptual oddities. She goes on to say of Pribram, currently, he is proposing a startling, all-encompassing model that is generating considerable excitement among those intrigued by the mysteries of human consciousness. His holographic model marries brain research to theoretical physics. It accounts for normal perception and simultaneously takes the paranormal and transcendental experiences out of the supernatural by explaining them as a part of nature. Like certain strange discoveries of quantum physics, the radical reorientation of this theory suddenly makes sense of paradoxical sayings of mystics throughout the ages. Self-cognition. To complete our outline of the process by which the mind achieves and exercises consciousness, we must also describe the mechanism which accounts for the aspect of human thought that differentiates it from the consciousness of plants or animals, i.e., self-cognition. Humans not only know, but they know that they know. They are able to monitor the process of their own thinking and maintain it as an awareness. Moreover, they can conduct a comparative assessment evaluating the functioning of their thought processes against various objective standards they have adopted. Human consciousness can do this because it has the capacity to duplicate aspects of its own hologram, project them out, perceive that projection, put it through comparison with the memory aspect, where its evaluation standards are measured and stored, of its own hologram, and measure or sense the differences using three-dimensional geometry and then binary go, no-go pulse to yield verbal cognition about the self. So I just scrolled past an image to read that last part, and I may have, I think it was in number 3 I mentioned using each ear as a dial, I think in chapter 3 of the Hemi-Sync process, and each ear is dialed in using the Hemi-Sync, and that's what we're sort of looking here when we look at this grid. We have a line going straight through the bridge of the nose to the back of the head, and then a line through the top of the head down through the chin. And they've broken a graphic of a face into specific quadrants. And those quadrants basically separate the ear, the eye, from their pairs, from their pairing partners. And I guess it would also separate your nostrils as well, although I don't know how that necessarily works. So what it has here on the actual drawing is consciousness energy grid, left hemisphere consciousness grid, and right hemisphere consciousness grid. The left hemisphere acts like the mind's computer software to reduce input from right hemisphere to verbal symbols and concepts. The right hemisphere reduces three-dimensional holographic image to a two-dimensional no-go holographic image. Well, I mean, I wouldn't know how to qualify this just right off the bat. It may be, I mean, this may be better as a conceptual graphic and only to help you become more aware that each eye is independent, each ear is independent, so that once you hit a transcendental meditative state, sort of where you relax your toes and just work that relaxation all the way up your body till you can feel everything and sense everything. And I think that's generally pretty much the process of any sort of meditative process or even yoga. But visually, I think this helps out with that. I don't know if it actually proves it or disproves it, because it lacks the total encompassing effect. It only shows how it identifies how something may be occurring, but it doesn't say why it's occurring, right? So if we say we use the light bulb reference again, where the light bulb goes on, it makes light, and then it also produces heat, and we use that to sort of explain the transmissions that emit from our brains or our soul or our consciousness, whereby energy can be actually tracked with certain EEGs and EKG machines or MRIs. And then also we have body heat, and there's other biofeedback and other biosignatures. It's not really it's not encompassing what that all turns into, thereby giving us the perception, right? They say the no go go. I mean, that is pretty it's reasonable and logical, but the entire process of consciousness is in a whole. And if I were to use something, I would have to use instinct, or what I described once as intuition, which is, for me, intuition is thought and action go by unnoticed by the brain. It's something that you can do intuitively or you do it instinctively. And when it goes by unnoticed, yet you benefit from that, or you're able to move right beyond that intuitive experience without any recognition of it and advance onto another level of whatever it is that you're doing. And it goes unrecorded by you. What is that? You know? What is your instinct on that level then? And we have a couple thoughts or notions being communicated to us here, maybe not clearly or concisely, but the idea is that, there's the intuitive self, and then there's the self that we have in relationship to one another. And those dynamics are what create our perceptions. It's fluid. It's always fluid. The go, no go. If I were to say, if I use the term fluid and go with that, water doesn't have a go and no go mechanism really. It goes where it can go. That's it. That's all it does. It doesn't. And if we say that water is instinct, and let's say a brick wall is learned, right? So we have intellect and instinct. Intellect is the brick wall, and water is the instinct. And water will go where water needs to go. It goes wherever it can. And a brick wall is built layer upon layer, and you can individually remove a specific brick, replace it. You can tear down the whole thing. You can do all that. And that really, to me, is the reasonable, logical side, the intellectual side of our consciousness. And then there's the water side, the fluid side, where intuition and instinct will provide learning and advancement and progress and intuitive strength and power, and it goes by unnoticed. So you could say, well, that's maybe part of the memory arts, and that's sort of where they're trying to teach people to be more conscious and aware of everything. However, this, for me, maybe because I have a little bit more, I don't want to say knowledge, but I've just expounded and read on various aspects of this type of thinking from different authors and different writers. To me, I already have a block up against this type of graphic or this go, no go thing, because I don't feel that I'm binary, and I don't think that a lot of other people are binary. I think there's habits. I think we develop habits, and that's a reductionist approach to keeping the complexity simple. But then that would mean it's really more of an intellectual process that creates the no-go or the go process. It's not an unconscious aspect of go or no-go. The unconscious aspect is the water that flows. The curiosity. Curiosity is said to kill the cat, but satisfaction brought it back, So let's move on to number 18 there. This is going to get a little bit more detailed, and maybe we go deeper into the well of the thoughts that the commander was putting together here. So this is number 18, the time-space dimension. Up to this point, our discussion of the gateway process has been relatively simple and easy to follow. Now the fun begins. Gateway involves more than just perception of those aspects of the universal hologram which can be accessed in the dimension of time-space as we know it. To explain how and why human consciousness can be brought to transcend the limitations of time and space is the next task which we must address. To do this, we must first appreciate what time and space are in order to understand how the dimension that they constitute can be transcended. Physicists define time as a measurement of energy or force in motion. In other words, it is a measurement of change. However, in order for energy to be in motion, it must first be limited in some way within the confines of some sort of vibratory pattern, so that its confinement gives it the capacity for being contained at a specific location which is distinguishable from other locations, a space. Energy which is not confined is force without limit, without dimension, without the limits of form. It is infinity, cannot move because there is nothing beyond infinity, and is therefore outside of the dimension of time. It is also beyond space because the concept implies that a specific energy form is limited to a specific location and is absent from other locations. But if energy is in the state of infinity, there are no boundaries, no here to differentiate from there. No sense of area. Energy in infinity means energy uniformly extended without limit. It has no beginning, no end, and no location. It is a conscious force, the fundamental, primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Energy in an infinity is said to be completely at rest and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. It retains its inherent capacity for consciousness in that it can receive and passively perceive holograms generated by energy in motion out in the various dimensions which make up the created universe, but it cannot be perceived by consciousness operating in the active universe. Energy in this state of inactive infinity is termed by physicists as energy in its absolute state, or simply the absolute. Between the absolute and the material universe in which we experience our physical existence are various intervening dimensions to which human consciousness in altered states of being may gain access. Theoretically, human consciousness may continue to expand the horizons of its perceptual capability until it reaches the dimension of the absolute, at which point perception stops being the absolute, generates no holograms of or about itself. So that's a lot to absorb, and some people listening to this may have understood that absolutely, and some of you and some of us may have not understood that at all. And I think that it actually loosely is correlating with my brick wall as intellect and water as intuition. And let's look at this again. Energy in infinity means energy uniformly extended without limit. It has no beginning, no end, no location. It is conscious force, the fundamental, primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Energy in infinity is said to be completely at rest and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. It retains its inherent capacity for consciousness in that it can receive and passively perceive holograms generated by energy in motion out in the various dimensions which make up the created universe, but it cannot be perceived by consciousness operating in the active universe. It sounds almost not paradoxical, but oxymoronic is a better word. In that, again, I think it's more of a biological limitation, whereby our eyes are not capable of picking up specific bandwidths of light and darkness, what we call darkness, and what we just say dark to light or light to dark, where we turn on a light or light a candle and then that darkness is there. We have to remember that there are animals who actually can see in that complete darkness, and it's not complete. It's not darkness. It's just a wavelength or a bandwidth or a spectrum, a different spectrum of non-light. So if we just remove the word energy here and we say light in infinity means light uniformly extended without limit, it has no beginning, no end, no location. It is a conscious force, the fundamental primal power of existence without form, a state of infinite being. Light in infinity is said to be completely at rest and therefore cannot generate holograms so long as it remains utterly inactive. It retains its inherent capacity for consciousness in that it can passively perceive holograms generated by light in motion, but in the various dimensions which make up the created universe. And light in this state of inactive infinity is termed by physicists as energy in its absolute state, or light in its absolute state. So light at rest would be darkness, or what we categorically with words define the lack of our ability to see that spectrum as darkness, because you have other creatures or animals and even technology where if it's dark out, we have a camera that may be able to show us the bioluminescence of a creature, and that's basically an aura camera, and you can find a cheap one on Amazon right now. So the aura does exist. It is generating energy or light. It is visible by something, just not fully by us. So again, the lack of our ability to recognize that band or that spectrum of light/energy does not mean absence of it. I hope that makes sense. It's a philosophical, it's kind of a bind or a tie between a philosophical principle known as absence of substance, becoming substance, meaning the quality of nothing being there can still be measured, thereby making something. We just read by, what we talked about in the previous one. Previous couple of sentences, physicists define time as a measurement of energy or force in motion. In other words, it is a measurement of change. Well, if change is constant, and which we know it is, and the expansion is constant, it's what absence substance does is it's like trying to say the lack of matches in a box is still a value, and we would call that -1. And that works for numbers. That kind of thinking works for numbers, but it's not actually how the universe operates in that way. We're just using an esoteric language to try to label and categorize a specific phenomena that we can't actually experience in real time, but we know it's there. So it's like a little bit of a confusion, because the math gives you a label, but we can't experience it. And they're trying to qualify that lack of experience as still an experience, right? It's like even saying that if I make a choice not to decide, I've still made a choice. That essentially what that means. So if we turn energy into light here, we just switch that word out and just kind of pretend that we're bats. And I know bats use sonar as well for echolocation, but that echolocation is still a form of perception or reception, whatever you want to call it. It occurs on a biological level, and that makes it a form of consciousness. It just because the mechanisms or the tools or the devices in which that consciousness is received doesn't take away that it's still a type of consciousness. So I'm sure the authors, obviously they know what they're talking about and they believed in what they said because they've gotten this far with their own research. I'm just trying to expound a little bit on the notions here in a more approachable way, using more allegories and metaphors that I think are more relatable. And when people use those terms, the absolute, those words are so well defined that they often confuse us. And absolute is, everything is absolute until it's not. That's it. There's I don't know what the quote is, but the premise of it is that anybody who creates a system is immediately the first person who's able to break that system. Anyone who creates a law will be the first one to be able to break that law, because the maker of that system is inherently also the destroyer of it as well, because they'll have the most intimate knowledge about it. And that's why a lot of times laws and systems and processes are sort of broken up among the sort of the federated or hub and spoke method, where multiple people work on multiple aspects, and that kind of, in a way, obfuscates or compartmentalizes the ability to break it thereafter. And, like I said, the word infinity and absolute, they do conjure up specific meanings for people, and they even conjure up specific symbols. So I'm just trying to neutralize whatever extra input people might be receiving from those words, and just say it's all the same. There is no darkness. It really is just a matter of being able to perceive that bandwidth. If you're in the forest and it's pitch dark, your ears are going to pick up where your eyes left off, and they absolutely will. You will be able to, your ears can be honed in such a way to compensate for the lack of what your eyes are doing. And then, based on what we've read so far overall through all of this documentation, the actual entire premise is where you're either using your ears, eyes, body, skin, vibration all at once. Everything has been combined into this great ability for you to use all of them in one absolute way. Or if we look at more like esoteric or religious texts, you're ascending out of all of these requirements to use your physical body to be conscious, and now you're a part of a light form or a light body or the gold body, or the construct of heaven, where heaven isn't really a destination. It's the experience. So I hope that a little bit of talking over this has helped define this a little bit better, and even maybe qualified my position on it, because again, words can be misleading. And in 2019 November, this year, or December, our time, basically, the words materialism and energy and absolute and the conscious force and all that stuff, it really has specific meanings for a lot of people, because someone who's listening to this right now may have their own well-established, well-practiced knowledge and skill already. So I don't want to either hurt this document or hurt the knowledge of it, but also we have to add to it and be willing to contribute to it in a way that allows it to move forward within the knowledge that we have now, 30 years later, 20 years later. Okay, so number 19, here we go, some good stuff again. Intervening dimensions. Since the absolute is conscious energy in infinity, i.e. without boundaries, it occupies every dimension to include time-space dimension, in which we have our physical existence, but we cannot perceive it. It overlays everything, as do many of the intervening gradients or dimensions through which the energies of the universe pass in their way to and from their home in the state of infinity. To enter these intervening dimensions, human consciousness must focus with such intense coherence that the frequency of the energy pattern which comprises that consciousness can accelerate to the point where the resulting frequency pattern, if displayed on an oscilloscope, would look virtually like a solid line. Achievement of this state of altered consciousness sets the stage for perception of a non-time-space dimension because of the operation of a principle in physics known as Planck's distance. This is an aspect of quantum mechanics which applies to the fact that any oscillating frequency, such as brainwaves, reaches 2 points of complete rest, which constitute the boundaries of each individual oscillation, i.e. movement up or down. Without these points of rest, an oscillating wave pattern would be impossible, since the points of rest are required to permit the energy to change direction and thus continue vibrating between rigid lines or rigid limits. But it is also true that when, for an infinitesimally brief instant, that energy reaches one of its 2 points of rest, it clicks out of time-space and joins infinity. See Exhibit 3, next page. We'll look at that. The critical step of the time-space occurs when the speed of the oscillation drops below 10 minus the 33rd power centimeters per second, Planck's distance. To use the words of Bentoff, quantum mechanics will tell us that when distances go below Planck's distance, which is 10 minus 33rd centimeters, we enter, in effect, a new world. To return our case in point, let me read that quote again. That caught me off guard there. To use the words of Bentov, quantum mechanics tell us that when distances go below Planck's distance, we enter, in effect, a new world. To return to our case in point, the human consciousness wave pattern reaches such a high frequency that the pattern of clickouts comes so close together that there is virtually continuity in it. I guess that's the vibratory pattern that we sort of recognize now, and also using the research from Sunstreak, where the heart rate and the pumping of blood becomes almost, if I were weightless in a weightless vacuum, how does blood pump, right? How does it move up and down? It's got to have a respiratory and a nervous system in order to make it go where it needs to go. Otherwise, the blood would just sit there and stagnate and not go anywhere. And in the same regarding this specific paper here, we read in the previous section that the brain actually sits within a fluid and a membrane that makes it float. So our brains are actually floating in our heads right now to begin with, because it's buoyant and it's floating in a thin membrane of liquid. So I think with that said, it's like when water on the surface of the ocean or a lake has absolutely no ripples in it, and it's just sitting there. Is that achieving an ultimate vibratory level? Is that what we're looking for? Stillness like water? Or when the waves are, constantly pinging back and forth from shoreline to shoreline, creating a sort of an alternative line, which occurs in the middle. If you've ever seen, the surface tension on water from both ends being centered into the middle, it doesn't spin. It creates a line, a noticeable line. Thus, as the almost continuous click-out pattern establishes itself in continuous phase at speeds below Planck's distance, but before reaching the state of total rest, human consciousness passes through the looking glass of time-space, after the fashion of Alice beginning her journey into Wonderland. The gateway experience, with its associated Hemi-Sync technique, I'm just going to screen capture this, is apparently designed, if used systematically and patiently, to enable human consciousness to establish a coherent pattern of perception in these dimensions where speeds below Planck's distance apply. This holds true irrespective of whether the individual is exercising his consciousness while in his physical body, or whether he is doing so after having separated the consciousness from the physical body, i.e. the so-called out-of-body state mentioned earlier. And I'm going to read through that again because I got sidetracked with, I'm sure that since I send these videos out with a couple of specific hashtags that everyone recognizes, the coincidence of both this statement here and this reference here. So that may or may not be coincidental. I understand, no coincidence, I get that, but it is pretty coincidental. So let's read this paragraph though. Again, the gateway experience with its associated Hemi-Sync technique is apparently designed, if used systematically and patiently, to enable human consciousness to establish a coherent pattern of perception in those dimensions where speeds below Planck's distance apply. This holds true irrespective of whether the individual is exercising his it's funny because, so it's like I use the term dead level, and you might hear me use terms like level and distance, and I often, the language could be referenced as Masonic because I use figure out, drawing, and I often use those words with the alternative meanings that they have. And it's interesting when you, if you've seen in my other videos where I am looking at decoding English arts as versus English arts, it's our entire vocabulary is laced with 3 to 4 types of accumulated knowledge sets, where some of our knowledge and the words we use are alchemical, some of the words and phrases we use are religious and philosophical, and some of them are Masonic, or what we should just call builder. And I don't mean from the occult aspect of any of those. I mean literally, if you're a chemist, if you're a philosopher of a religion, or a theologian, excuse me. I'm going to shift to my seat. Or a maker, builder, drawer, artist. Like leveling out, when I said dead level. And that's actually a term you would use if you were building a house or trying to find the horizon line or something like that with levels, or a plumb, using a plumb and a plumb line. The idea here, I guess, is correlating with that, where I said you have to be dead level for your blood to both not have to pump, but be so synchronized that it's just moving on its own through your body, I guess. Because if you just bear with me on this. If you take an out-of-body experience, right, what happens to your body? What kind of default mode is it going into? And you could say, okay, well, time doesn't exist, space doesn't exist, so you leave your body, you come back, and you feel like it really only occurred in an instant. Okay, fine. That I understand what that statement means, but what that translates into is, now, just bear with me as I go through this. If I take an out-of-body experience and I'm gone 4 hours, and I go back into my body, and I wake up and somebody says, you were only gone for 4 minutes. Okay, so something was happening to my body. That instinct and intellect, the body took care of stasis. It went into stasis. It would have had to have gone into stasis, because I'm no longer consciously aware of the blood, my toes, my ears, whatever. You say, well, it's the synchronization. You're doing both, but I'm not, because I'm not aware of it. I'm not retaining any knowledge of it when I'm in the projection mode, when I'm in astral plane. And the only thing that would most likely bring me back is pain, where the body goes into fight or flight mode. And, or in some cases, right, the pain is so severe, you don't come back. You can't come back, because now your body that was in stasis is gone. It's that may be a pretty interesting explanation for ghosts too. But, the point I'm getting to is, if those 4 hours that I was gone, and actually I guess this references that movie Contact from the 90s, where she was gone for a couple seconds, and although the video recorder that she carried with her had 18 hours of recording on it of static, that video recorder is basically our brain in my discussion right now. So I have 4 hours of memories. Hopefully I've been able to retain them. 4 hours of memories. And I was only gone for 4 minutes. Anybody is going to immediately work out a math equation on that. Like I would too. I'd be like, well, wait a minute. This has to be what we might as well just look at a computer hard drive now. How is it storing all those data bits when it didn't happen to me physically, when I actually did not experience that with my body? So I have a couple questions about that, as if I'm going through this looking glass and I'm starting my journey into Wonderland. How am I recording all of that in the astral without having a direct transmission to my physical, but then still only, I guess, time's only elapse, how does time elapse differently on different timelines? And I'm sure that there's, we may even get into that in other discussions, but that really, it almost, in a way, if I were a psychologist, I would say that's the notion of or a potential of schizophrenia, altered states, or I guess they're called alts. Alts would be the word. And there's a little bit of confusion for me in that. Just I like I said, I understand exactly what's being said here and what the author wants us to understand. But the out of state process where I questioned, or where I sort of said it's more like thought travel. If a radio antenna is broadcasting, the antenna itself doesn't ever leave its position. What happens is eventually that signal is either picked up by another antenna, or it just goes by unnoticed, right? It doesn't get picked up ever again. And if we use that analogy for us, our bodies and our brains, our brain being that light bulb, that antenna, we're not physically leaving anywhere. It's just our ability to broadcast our consciousness wider, not leave anything, if that makes sense. It instead of a higher state of consciousness or astral projection or transcendental, all great descriptions, it's more like wideness. It's like, well, your antenna just has to be better at picking up the broadcast that's already occurring somewhere else, right? Like that antenna that's on the corner or down the street or a couple miles away from you. Eventually, it's either got to be taller, wider, or just take a hard line and directly connect it to another antenna. But that antenna doesn't ever leave. It doesn't have its own consciousness. It doesn't go anywhere. It just gets better at broadcasting. Its signal strength is more energetic and stronger. So I would say that what I'm trying to do is apply that to this thinking. Because for me, and I wrote this down in some session notes of my own, it feels more like wideness. I'm just getting wider. Not leaving anything, not traveling anywhere. It's just the antenna, my antenna strength is more energetic. My ability to broadcast and receive input from other antenna becomes a little bit more, I guess, sharp and in focus. So not to belittle any of this, and this is great stuff. I love reading it. It really does show how smart a lot of the people are that in some ways run the world that we live in. And the out of body thing is always what's throwing me off, because I get the stories of traveling high above and looking at stuff like that, and I've experienced very similar processes, but I never felt disconnected from my body. And the difference is I have to say, actually, now that I think about it, that memory came back, a few memories. I've never actually been able to look back at my own body. I know people say that they do, but when I'm in a projection, or I'm doing it and dreaming, and I happen, I'm lucky enough in this case to remember that dream or know that I'm actually dreaming, so I can kind of navigate and do what I want. When I try to look down at my own body or look at my own, sometimes I can see my hands a little bit, but I actually don't see any physical components of myself. I may be interacting with people, but it's not like you do in the physical plane where I have peripheral vision and I have the ability to, like, I can see the rim of my glasses or my nose, or I can see, stubble on my chin or my beard with my peripheral vision. When I'm in astral projection or when I'm in lucid dreaming, I don't see any of those physical attributes. They don't register at all. And I've consciously made efforts to try to do that. Now, when I was younger, and I only remember this story because I recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, gave it to what I believe was a fielding experiment for myself by a couple agency people. For me, I think everyone's had the dream of the flying dreams and the running dreams. And for me, The flying dreams eventually turned into running really fast, like literally speed, like I could just traverse whatever distance I wanted to. However, with the flying, I never had accelerated speed. I just had the ability to kind of soar and float. But in both of those situations, at no time was I ever able to actually, through the projection, in the projection, perceive my actual body in any meaningful way. So I know people say that they do that, and whatever. I don't think it's possible, because the entire point of this consciousness, this new ascension, or whatever it is that you're doing, is that your body's not there. I doubt, even if we were to go at this philosophically or logically, like I said, it's thought travel. I don't think the antenna doesn't leave the hill. The antenna doesn't know that the antenna is somewhere else. It's just that transmission wave, that energetic transmission wave, is able to sync up with the other antennas and then thereby move information along. But there's no consciousness. And I think if we take that a little bit further with some of the more esoteric teachings, even psychological teachings in the 18 and 1900s, the idea of ego, or the material ascension, is exactly that. Like, there's got to be a point where your body's not going anywhere. And if these really detailed stories of people who work in the military, who have, time traveled and done all these other things. I forget what the TV series was, but the idea in some of them was that the consciousness traveled to another body, but the body never left anywhere. You know what I mean? Your body's not going anywhere. So if the whole idea is to leave your ego behind and leave your material world behind, you're not taking your body with you. You're not taking your pair of pants that you like so much. You're not dressing up for that remote viewing session in your favorite gear. It's just not going to happen. Like, none of that makes any sense in relationship to this stuff. So again, I'm just trying to bring some more contemporary stories to, for some of us, maybe really old cliches, because we've been exposed to so much media and content in a satirical or entertainment way that we forget how much that's already sort of, unfortunately, defined everything for us. So we have to unlearn it all. And I'm just trying to unwrap that a little bit and remove some barriers from the learning process with my own personal experiences, and with a little bit of qualitative argument against how things are being described. So if it helps you to think that your body is literally gone, and that you really have to leave yourself, I will say it's better to imagine yourself as an animal and think of it that way. And there are plenty of texts, and there is plenty of research as well, that if we were to use, say, like what's known as Odin's eye, or Odin's eyes, which were his ravens, that's basically what we're talking about there. That we have that ability to, if I want to use the eyes or ears of a bat, that might be happening. That's possible to do that. It's possible for my antenna to connect that antenna, and then maybe those flying and running experiences are literally like whatever dimension or timeline, however you want to reference that. Yeah, you may be there in a physical body, excuse me, but it may not be your body. You've actually just jumped consciousness to someone else in another dimension. Or you're in I've had an experience, a recent session about 2 months ago, where after I did the drawings and did the translations myself, it occurred to me that I must have been an insect, or some sort of rodent or rat or something in an ventilation system. So Like I was in the room and I could see certain things, but I realized some of the things that were obstructing me, the angles from which I saw everything, indicated that I was extremely small. And since I can only see certain colors, it would have indicated to me that I was more of an animal, not using my own, not using my typical consciousness perspective of the spectrum that I'm aware of in memory. And then at other times I've obviously had sessions where it's me and well, not me, but a human, and I can see everything from the human perspective. I'm interacting with other humans and experiencing that way. But I know that sounds, for a lot of people, they're just probably already turned this off a while ago since I started ranting. But if you've made it this far, that gift, that talent, those abilities are all referenced in one way or another. Whether it's Odin's eyes, the Christic or the Christos, the ascension, the light body, or the thought transference, transcendental meditative experience, or even using sound. Like here they're calling it Hemi-Sync, but I mean, what do we think Tibetan monks were doing in the caves? That's exactly what they were doing. They were creating their own pitch and tones to create that transcendental, that ohms, that om. They were doing that as their own variation of this process with ancient knowledge. Not old, not antiquated, not stupid, not untechnological, but actually highly technological in the way that it only relied on the human body. It had no other interdependency or codependency on material tools to ascend the material plane. So, I mean, in a way, you could call Hemi-Sync a version of cybernetics, because it's not utilizing the skills of the human body to transcend. But I hope that this little rant has been worth it on that one. Let me stop at, let me see what we got here. Subatomic particles, dimensions in between. I'll come back to that for the next chapter, but let's look at this graphic as it was referenced in this paragraph here. Now, again, we have a two-dimensional drawing that's supposed to represent a three-dimensional space for all of us. And I don't know, does this work actually? There we go. All right, so most texts, a lot of ancient texts will give you this. And this is really what occurs to us. This is how a dimensional space would be created. What we see this happening here, the sin wave or the scene wave, the most important parts are not the top right there or the bottom of the experience. What you want to do is learn this part right here. Anytime you can be aware of that as it starts to occur at this point, because this is the most important. This is when you know change is going to occur and at some point on this. Or, let me redefine that a little bit. If we just say here and here, these are the actual moments, not the peaks or and this has no negative or positive. This shouldn't be like, oh, this is goodness up here, this is badness down here. That's not what it's about. It has nothing to do with any of that. This drawing and the way these things are constantly represented like this, and then they'll say, oh, well, there's another one, and this is everybody working together. If we put this on a three-dimensional scale, it would be like this. And I don't think that people recognize that. And this is what gives us from an esoteric standpoint, this is what gives us what we call our seasons and our biological and reproductive cycles that constantly repeat. Because as I said, if we don't pay attention to the ups and downs and we just look for when the ups and downs are going to occur, that gives us, when we translate this to a three-dimensional plane, our sense of time. Like that may be where your time is experienced. This may be where someone else's time is experienced. On this part of the curve, that may be experienced. And then when that's all said and done, if you've seen some of the other videos I've done, if I were to look at this from the pure top, right, this is what that looks like if I had the bird's eye view. Because this would show depth, time, and distance, where this is the most current occurring now. This is far back in ancient history in the middle here. And then, like I said, your timeline would be here. And my timeline might be here. And their timeline may be there. And all you're really doing is somehow tapping into this curve for my timeline into your timeline. Let me get the pen back out there. I'm tapping into this curve to get here. Or conversely, or adversely, I'm just saying, okay, if this is my timeline, this guy right here, and I want to go all the way down to this timeline, how do I do that? So I wanted to do this drawing because I think it's important to everything, to give everybody a little bit more qualitative insight into how these work. Now that I've described that, excuse me, let's look at what the actual drawing says and attribute that to it. So we have energy, the oscillation, and the wave. So the energy is the starting point. The oscillation is the entire pattern as itself. And then the wave is where the pattern, the oscillation changes. So clicked out portion of the oscillating energy traversing intermediate dimensions. And the dimensions are just the various aspects of the golden sorrel, right? The golden meaning. These are just different dimensions. And all that means is just further or forward in time. Because if we consider what they mean about infinity or absolute, we know that the cycles of life, the cycles of reproduction, the cycles of the, let's just call it the planets for now, the cycles of those things are perpetual. Doesn't matter, doesn't mean that they were exactly the same or anything. I'm not trying to be absolute with that stuff, but time, as we've just been told, and as many people will agree, is a construct, and that life has been going on somewhere, somehow, somewhere else still. So any sort of dimensional travel is just really finding which part, forward or backwards, you want to travel on. And if this is where you are, and you're trying to figure out how to get to this part in this dimension, you're kind of like, I guess, jumping from arc to arc, right? So then we have this section here, portion of the oscillating energy pattern in time-space. And then we have clicked out portion of oscillating energy in intermediate dimensions. So he's did a great drawing and it's been very clear, but doing it this way would have been more helpful. Because if I take what the commander has drawn out, or whoever drew this out, the energy that's created is going to be in the middle. There's going to be all of this movement in time is going to create this center of energy. And that's what this is. And then the clicked out portions are exactly like I said. That's here or here. And this may be, this is when you, I guess, if we look at it this way, and I just say that this one, let's say, A is A over here. I guess this is where you're able to like go bloop, and that if we look back at the remote viewer experiences from the Sunstreak debriefing, where the monitor has certain details, or someone has certain details, or someone has enough information, what it seems to me is like people are also, you either have physical objects that work as the wayfinding system because they contain energy from the previous time period or person who was transmitting energy from their brain while making it or when it was made, right? Or someone has enough detail or enough information about that time period to allow you to circumnavigate where to jump and recognize where you're going. So you're moving along the center line, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, got it. I know where I need to go. I recognize what that is, and that's where I'm going. Or in other cases, you don't know where you're going and you spiral out, right? Spiral out. So let me get rid of these things. Maybe go through that once or twice, because it sounded succinct to me, and I've wanted to always talk about how this is, not only is it the golden ratio, but it's time and space. It represents time and space. And a lot of ancient Chinese texts, if you ever come across this graphic, you're going to find some pretty cool stuff, because this is what actually happens. So to time. This is what a lot of their texts will say happened to time. And what happens is when I talk about wideness, not moving forward, not moving backwards, it's just being wider. If I'm on this part of the timeline here, all I want to do is just widen. That's all I'm doing, because my body can't leave. It's not going to go anywhere. Maybe there's technology now that allows that to happen. I don't know. Whatever. I don't want to debate that point just yet or introduce that notion. But for me, if I just want to I guess projection would still work in this case. If I project, I'm actually just widening. I'm just getting a little bit wider. Maybe I can widen this way, but I still remain here. I'm not actually going anywhere. And I think that that's part of the egocentric problem of trying to bring your body with you, or perceive that you're taking yourself with you, and you're not. You're doing a little bit of thought travel, all the way up or all the way down, or if we remove direction, all the way around, all the way in, all the way forward or backwards, however you want to discuss it, or however you want to interpret it. Okay, so number 20, subatomic particles. This looks like we're going to get into what I was just talking about. The behavior of subatomic particles provides an interesting example of the phenomenon by clicking out discussed in the preceding paragraphs. In an article prepared for Science Digest magazine, Dr. John Gleedman mentions the way in which subatomic particles communicate with each other once their energy fields become entrained as a result of colliding with each other. Right? Collision. The communication concerned is, of course, postulated to be occurring during the clickout phase, in the oscillation of the energy field comprising the subatomic particles concerned. It is this cause which accounts for the cross-communication at what in terms of time-space velocities would seem to involve speeds in excess of light. In reality, Einstein's theory of relativity is not being invalidated, but rather the communication concerned is taking place outside the dimension of time-space to which the theory of relativity is strictly confined. That's kind of a band-aid, I would say. I mean, if anybody who's not familiar with Einstein's relativity, you might have just got a nice little glimpse, right? Because this was written pretty well of what it was supposed to mean and what they're talking about. Like, if you don't even know how people came up with the idea of dimension, those couple of sentences just kind of should have helped you out a little bit. But to me, it's kind of a band-aid. Specifically, Dr. Gleedman tells us, quantum theory postulates a kind of long-range Siamese twin effect whenever two subatomic particles collide and then go their different ways. Even when the particles are halfway across the universe from each other, it says they instantly respond to each other's actions. And in so doing, they violate relativity's ban on faster-than-light velocities. Indeed, regarding attempts to quantify what is known about the behavior of energy in dimensions apparently outside of time-space, Bentov speaks about courageous physicists who are working on hypothetical particles called tachyons, which can move at speeds higher than light. The speed of tachyons start just above the speed of light and range all the way to infinite velocities. So let's stop with dimensions in between, because that will go into a lot more. It's going to start off. Now I have my own issues with that word there, and I'm not going to expound on it, because what I actually, if we're supposed to believe in time and space and forward, what we're talking about are relatives, right? And a lot of people from the esoteric and religious sides will recognize the idea of bloodlines and DNA and those kind of terms. So if I have a relative here and a relative here, and I'm right here, or if we take the idea of dimensions and say that there's just an alternate timeline altogether, right? So there's an alternate timeline for that person and an alternate timeline for this person, and this is where I am, and this is where I am in the other one. All that's occurring is somehow the body as an antenna. What I would say is that it's not tachyons. I think that's a bit materialistic. We just keep coming up with these new words that just still somehow paint a materialist picture, like somehow we're going to be able to see a tachyon or a subatomic particle with our own eyes. And I think that's where it gets confusing for people. But what I see is that you kind of hack the time-space distance, right, with your own DNA, your own biology, and you just kind of somehow are able to transmit information. Or in this case, you hack the dimensional plane, and remember that this actually looks like a plane, right? Looks like a plane with coordinates. So don't get lost on the tachyons thing. I don't know. I'm not saying that they're not right. I know that there's a lot of interesting papers on it even today, but my personal opinion based on just magnetism and light and how they interact, I don't see a justification for tachyons in that way. I do see our bodies being, if as we've read in other papers, or maybe even in this one actually, that somehow thought transference occurs faster than light, it's a bit of a disservice to call it a tachyon and conceptually put it into a modality close to particles, because I get that you're trying to show that somehow energy would have to travel on something or through something or be contained within something. Like, let's bring this down to language, like a calorie, a caloric count in your body, right? We supposedly burn calories. We're told that these little things contain energy. The reality is that no one knows what's in a calorie. They don't know what a calorie is. It's just this, again, it's just this thing that we've measured, but we don't know what it is. We don't know it's actually being expended. And I think for people who are physically fit or not fit too, you'll recognize during seasons and different emotional states of mind too, where you literally feel like everything you're working on is somehow not changing your body. And that's because, yeah, I get fat and muscle is more dense than fat, and if you don't have enough body fat, your body will start to burn muscle. And I recognize all of those things. However, it doesn't mean we know what a calorie is. We really don't. We don't even know how they're expelled from the body. Like, where is this unit? Because you're kind of creating a physical manifestation or a materialistic property that contains this burned energy of ours. You know, as I burn calories, where's the waste go? Where's the byproduct of a calorie? What is the byproduct of a calorie? It would have to be energy, right? It would have to be energy somehow. It'd have to be carbon or right? I mean, that's just following the rules that we've been taught. That's what that would have to mean. So in this case, going back to the tachyons, what is the byproduct of a tachyon then? How would that even work? Where it makes more sense that the ether is somehow more real than we've been told. And even as this quote up, the quantum theory postulates faster than light travel. So Einstein's not wrong, but then they have to come out and say, well, it's another dimension outside of time and space. Well, then there's different terms for the word dimension, because some people think dimension means another reality. And then other people say dimension means it's something beyond the exponential properties of our existing energy-based universe. And that could certainly be a result of pop culture and too much storytelling time, but it's not very well defined for us to grasp onto if we're someone who's trying to understand gateway experience or remote viewing or transcendental meditation. If we just kind of relinquish all that materialistic talk and maybe just use drawings more or less without trying to label the drawings, like I just showed you how this wave should actually be represented for everybody, at least in my opinion. And the way I drew it like this, it makes much more sense, when we consider things like time and seasonal cycles of the planet and our biological cycles, our sexual reproduction cycles, our cycles of interest, our cycles of love, and all that, astrological cycles. It's a spiral. It's a very, and then again, one of the most sacred symbols you'll see, often repeated, either drawn perfectly or, in some form or another, like this. It's the same circle. It's a representation of energy and time in motion, not where this graphic here does us a little bit of a disservice because it's two-dimensional when it really would look like this. So drawing is sometimes better than talking. And I think that is one of the reasons why they go through the training process using the arts or trying to educate people in the arts. But okay, so let's end this here. And let me just stop at dimensions in between. Oops. And that's where I'll pick up on number 5. All right, have a good day.